All right, well, good evening. We're about to begin our discussion on a somewhat unpleasant topic because we're talking about grief, we're talking about loss, and the difficulty surrounding that and some of the factors associated with it. So, not a fun thing to talk about, but something that's needed, something that's important, and something that will hopefully be beneficial as we explore some different topics. What are some of the things we're going to be talking about? We'll talk, number one, about understanding grief. We're going to talk about some common reactions to grief. Grief and depression, what are some of the similarities as well as differences between the two? Stages of grief, and most importantly, steps towards healing from grief. Because grief is not where a person wants to stay. Ultimately, the goal is to move towards healing. So, how can we define it? Grief can be defined as an emotional reaction to a significant loss and is characterized by sadness. And whenever we think of grief or think of the realities of it, normally it's associated with something that a person has lost. Now, commonly, when we think about grief, it's losing a loved one. But what we're going to see is that it can be lost in a number of other areas, not just someone passing away. Grief is experienced by both children and adults. Now, how they will experience it or express it may be different. In some cases, it may be similar, but both of which experience it. So this is something that's common regardless of a person's age. What are some of the sources of grief? As I've said, perhaps the most common aspect of grief is losing a family member for whatever reason, whether it's expected or unexpected. Losing a close friend. You know, sometimes, depending on a person's upbringing, a friend might even be closer to someone than their biological family member. So even losing a close friend can lead one to grief. Losing a job, especially if it's a job that a person really wanted, a job that a person worked hard for, may even be something that they've done for decades. And then at some point, the job is gone and the grief follows. Loss of health and or independence. This could be somebody who comes down with some kind of debilitating disease. They can't function the way they used to. This person may be the kind of person who used to be very outdoors type, love to be active and engaged. That's taken away from them, and grief is what follows as a result. Even loss of familiarity. When I was researching this and I came across this, I thought it was interesting how a person can actually experience a deep sense of grief if they end up, say, having to relocate, and it's against their will. Sometimes this happens with young people, children, their parents maybe get a job somewhere else and they end up having to follow them, leave behind all their other family members, friends, what they're familiar with, and as a result, they may experience that time of grief as well. One of the common ways, most common ways grief is expressed is anger. Because in some cases a person isn't quite sure how to best deal with it, and so they respond in anger. They find themselves lashing out and getting upset easily. Find themselves maybe the person who no one really wants to be around anymore because of what they are experiencing. It may be anger that they are expressing, but when it's grief, what that really means is there's something beneath the surface that's not being properly attended to. Now, I know that the screen is somewhat of a distance away, but if you see at the top of this iceberg is the word grief. A host of other terms are listed, emotions, experiences, but grief is right at the top. Because oftentimes that's what's really happening. When a person is experiencing anger, what it's really meaning is that there is grief that's going on, and this is how they are expressing it. So when we see someone who appears to be angry and on the edge and easily upset, it may not be because that's just their personality. It might not be because that's just who they are. They're a difficult person. It might be they've recently experienced some significant loss. And if they're able to work through that loss, then we will probably see these anger episodes subside. Sometimes people cope with grief through isolation, keeping to themselves, not being as engaged, not being as social as they used to be. Just staying at home, staying away from the crowd, even perhaps avoiding friends and family members. Because what they're dealing with, maybe there's a sense in which they believe that no one can really relate, no one can really understand, and because of that, no one can really help them solve what they're dealing with. So they may find themselves just keeping alone, isolation. This seems to be reflected in the psalmist who wrote, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and storm." And isn't that how some people respond to grief? Wanting to fly away, wanting to get away from everybody, get away from everything, and just be all alone. This is what the psalmist is saying, thinking about the dove and how they can just go wherever they want, whenever they want. But unfortunately, we can't do that. Sometimes grief may even lead to a desire to simply give up. Overwhelmed, especially if it's persistent. The person doesn't feel as though there's any end in sight, no light at the end of the tunnel. And so this may lead the person to abandon all hope of ever recovering, ever getting back to a place of normalcy, and just wanting to end it because they cannot deal with the grief feelings that they have. Now, one of the things that I'm hoping will come through this is that we're recognizing the difference between the healthy and the unhealthy ways of coping with grief. The one thing that these three all have in common, whether it's anger, isolation, or a desire to give up, they all represent unhealthy ways of coping with grief. And these are not the best ways to actually deal with what a person is experiencing. Job is someone who knew something about grief. You're familiar with the biblical story of Job, the person who suffered perhaps more than anyone else in all of history in terms of loss. And he had a series of experiences that would naturally lead anybody to grieve. As a matter of fact, if the average person experienced what he went through, that person would probably be in an insane asylum, all of what he experienced. So it's understandable why he might have even said something like this: "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life." So Job was ready to end it all. I mean, imagine that, losing all of your children, losing all of your cattle, losing your livestock, losing your health, losing your sense of well-being, all within the span of a couple of days. Losing all of that and finding yourself at this place of wanting to just end it all. Now, what we're going to see as we go forward is not only with Job, but just dealing with grief in general, he didn't do it. He didn't even attempt it because there was a recognition that despite all of the loss, all of the grief, there was still a sense in which God was in control and he knew that he could trust him. Now let's talk about grief and depression. And what are some of the differences between the two? This is important because if we know, or whether it's ourselves or someone that we know that's dealing with this, then whether it's grief or depression can inform how the person should go about trying to address the problem. So symptoms of grief include feelings of emptiness and loss. With depression, there is an inability to anticipate happiness. With grief, it tends to decrease in intensity over time, whereas with depression, it's more persistent. With grief, there may be moments of positive emotions and humor, whereas when it's depression, it's pervasive unhappiness and misery. Grief, preoccupation with thoughts of the loss. With depression, that's self-critical, pessimistic ruminations. With grief, the self-esteem is preserved, whereas with depression, there are feelings of worthlessness. And lastly, remember, going back to that willingness to end it all because one is grieving. If a person is merely grieving, then they may view ending their life as an effort to be reunited with a loved one. Whereas if a person is in a state of depression, they may see ending their life as a way to simply escape the pain. So the point here is to think about, perhaps we may know someone or we may encounter someone. They're sad, they're down, and it doesn't seem like they're coming through it. Well, depending on which of these two they're dealing with, that could inform how we should go about trying to get them help or trying to help them ourselves. Obviously, the depression is more serious, even though there can still be a desire for one to end their life. If they're grieving, we see some of the indicators of depression where it's more persistent and it doesn't necessarily just get better over time. And there is even the inability to anticipate any kind of happiness coming forth. So this is one of the reasons why when a person is dealing with a persistent form of depression or a major form of it, why they need a different kind of help than just, say, someone who might be grieving loss, because over time the symptoms are likely to improve. Now it's important to understand what might be going on in the mind of someone who's grieving and where they are in the process. So typically what may happen in the case of what are known as the stages of grief, when something first happens, when the loss is first experienced, they might be in what is called the denial stage. And they may be saying something like, "This is not happening." So that means there's a refusal to acknowledge the fact of the loss. There's a refusal to really admit that what's happening is in fact happening, being in denial and thinking that this just is not reality. Going back to our earlier statement about how grief is sometimes expressed, anger may be the second stage. So at this point, the person might have realized that, okay, this is happening, but I'm clearly not happy about it. This shouldn't be happening to me. And it could even lead to feelings of unfairness and even blame. Now, if we think about this from a spiritual standpoint, think about sometimes what happens in the life of the believer who experiences something and they think, this should not be happening to me. I do the things I'm supposed to do. I live a fairly upright life. I go to church every Sunday. I read the Bible. I pray. I do these things. I should not be experiencing what I'm experiencing. Imagine Job probably had some of those same thoughts. In fact, it even says that Job was described as a righteous man. So he was doing the things, just like I was saying, doing the things that he was supposed to do, and yet look what he encountered. So anger is a natural expression of grief when we feel as though we're not being treated fairly, when we feel as though we're not getting essentially what we deserve. Bargaining. I am willing to do anything to change this. When a person is in this particular stage, they may be searching for unlikely solutions, trying to find a way to avoid it actually continuing on in this place of reality. trying to find some solution that can undo the loss, even though they've already perhaps admitted that it has happened. So again, you see the thought processes that a person may be going through when they are grieving, willing to do anything to change the situation, even if it is totally out of their control and they have no power to do anything about it. Number 4, depression. How can I go on after this? This is where recognizing and grieving the loss begins. Because where we've come from a state of denial, so the person is no longer in a place of saying, this is not reality. Now the person might have transitioned into, after that, they transitioned into anger, and now they're reacting to it because they're not happy about the loss. And then they began bargaining, thinking that, okay, maybe there's something that can be done to change it, to alter it, to go back to where it was before the loss actually occurred. None of that has solved it. So now depression may set in. And this is where the person not only recognizes, but they begin to grieve the loss. This is where we might actually see expressions of sadness, isolation, keeping to oneself, not wanting to even be involved in some of the things they perhaps were involved in before. However long it takes the person to go through those first 4 stages, the goal is for them to eventually get to the 5th one, and that is acceptance. This is where the person can say with a sense of confidence that I will be okay. This is where the person begins to understand the loss logically while coming to terms with it emotionally. Say, for example, a person loses a parent, and they go through these stages, and now they're at the acceptance stage. They understand it logically. Every day people die. So they begin to understand that this does happen. But they begin to come to terms with it also emotionally, recognizing that life can go on despite this loss. As a matter of fact, there are things that can be done to actually eventually see something come out of this situation. So I have here at the bottom that acceptance is the goal for healing. Because as the person embraces this and realizes that they can be okay despite such a significant loss, that's when they are prepared to begin to take steps forward to actually move in the direction of healing. There's no way to know how long a person may be in these stages. If you remember when we go back to the first 3 that we saw in the previous slide, denial, no way to know how long a person may be there, how long they'll be in the anger or the bargaining stages, or even in the depression stage. But however long it takes, if the person gets to acceptance, then that's when the real healing can take place, and that is what we want people to experience. What are some of those healing steps? Well, let's see a brief video from someone that we may all be familiar with.
And my son, we're having a very hard time with it. I don't know how to go on when the other half of me is already gone. You know, we're just at a standstill. We don't know what to do or how to live without him. He was our hero.
First thing I will tell you is not to isolate yourself at all, because this is overwhelming. It's overwhelming for you. You have children to nurture and mentor when you yourself feel like you've had your heart ripped out.
Exactly. And
it's hard to give away what you don't have.
Exactly.
So you need to let people minister to you as well. You need to go to your church. You need to go to family members. You need to let your friends and neighbors. And you know, we always wonder if someone's lost someone and you see them at the grocery store or whatever, do you bring it like if they seem like they're doing okay, people feel like, well, I don't want to bring them down by mentioning it. That's the wrong thing to do. And I hope if your friends and family are watching this, they don't need to wonder if it's gone away, because it hasn't.
It'll never.
So they need to reach out to you, and you need to let them. Don't isolate. Don't tell, oh, we'll be okay. You don't do that. Say, we're lost. We're reeling. We don't know what to do. So take the help. If somebody wants to fix dinner for you, let them. If they want to watch the kids, let them. If they want to come over and just sit with you and cry with you, let them talk about this. Give it a voice and get it out. And encourage your children to do so as well. It's really important that they not go back in their room and sit there and feel like, I don't want to make mommy cry, so I can't mention that I'm scared or afraid or confused. Let them know it's okay that we cry. We cry together. Yeah, and let them know that. It's okay. Come sit in mom's lap. We'll cry together. Don't make them feel guilty if they say or do something that upsets you. And don't you feel guilty about them seeing you cry. What you're doing is modeling for them when we lose things we love, when we lose people we love, we do hurt, we do cry, and they will also observe you survive, and so they learn it hurts and we cry, but we do get past it. We are resilient. We do move on. So I encourage you to reach out, not be isolated, talk to your children a lot, and go on a mission. You will find strength and purpose, and that's why I say you need to talk about this.
Now, Dr. Phil mentioned a point that we discussed earlier about the importance of avoiding that tendency towards isolation. Because remember what he was saying. Yes, it may be desirable to keep to oneself, but that's going to work against one in the long run. We need the very people, when a person is grieving, they need the very people who care for them, who love them, who want to support them. We need them to be there in those moments. And so isolation is actually self-defeating. That's not going to help the person. So it was helpful that he brought that out. And then also just the importance of talking it out. Because let's face it, sometimes we're grieving. What don't we want to do? Talk about what we're grieving about. We don't want to keep rehashing it over and over again. And we don't want someone that's going to listen and start trying to give us all pieces of advice. Sometimes what we try to do, or what we are inclined to do, is just keep to ourselves. So the point that I appreciate, some of the points I appreciate about what he said, is the importance of avoiding isolation and being willing to talk it through. Being willing to communicate and share openly and honestly, because that's a big part of the healing process. We're going to look at a couple more verses on the topic of grief acceptance. Remember, this is that final stage where healing begins to move forward. So I already mentioned Job previously, but there's also something else he said. The end of the first chapter, when he first began experiencing loss, he says, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." It's easy to say, the name of the Lord be praised when the Lord gives. But are we able to say it when he also takes away? Well, in Job's case, he could. So he came, this was an expression of his acceptance. Yes, the Lord blessed me with all of these things, even all of the children that I have, but there comes a time when loss is inevitable. And so because of that, the name of the Lord is to be praised even when there is loss. He also said towards the end, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted." You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. See, now he's thinking it through a little bit more, and this is where more of the interaction between Job and God begins, and he's expressing himself and realizing that he may never know why he went through what he went through. He may never know why he experienced the grief and the loss that he did. But these are things that he could not fully understand. He says, things too wonderful for me to know. Of course, someone experiencing that kind of loss is going to come up with the question, why? Why am I going through this? Why are we experiencing this? Why such loss? But Job got to a place of acceptance where he realizes that, yes, the Lord gives, the Lord also takes away. Now, there's also a sense in which he wondered whether or not he brought this on himself. And this was later explained, although God never explained to Job why he went through what he went through. You could still see the acceptance in the language that he uses. He even says, I know you can do all things. You know what's implied in that? You could have prevented all of this from happening, but you didn't. So maybe the reason you did it is because there was some purpose. There was some meaning behind it, even if I never know what it is. The psalmist also said, be merciful to me, Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and body with grief. But I trust in you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands. This is my favorite part, the last line here. My times are in your hands. I think some translations say, my life is in your hands. You see, that's acceptance language. It's saying that despite the feelings and despite the grief and despite the sorrow, God is still in ultimate control. And his times are in the hands of God. And that includes the good and the bad. That includes the gains and the losses. It includes, it's just like vows, when vows are exchanged for better or worse, sickness and in health. So this is acceptance language in saying that regardless of what happens, God is still there and in control. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles. A couple of observations. Number one, it's clear that it doesn't say that obviously there will be no need for comfort. There will be. That's why he emphasizes that the Father is the God of compassion, the God of all comfort, because he knows there will be times when it's needed. There will be times when a person is grieving and God is there. And it says he comforts us in all our troubles. How does he do it? Sometimes he does it through other people. And this is the reason why isolation is so counterproductive. Because sometimes the way in which God may comfort his people is through other people. And that may be how he uses them, when he uses them, because he knows someone is grieving and they may need a touch, may need a hug, may need a phone call, may need someone to just sit there with them. So again, that's one of the most important aspects of the healing process, letting people in to talk, to listen, and to work through the process together. 7 strategies for coping with grief. Number 1, take time out. Separate the things that must be done from those that can wait. Because when a significant loss occurs, sometimes it causes us to re-examine our priorities. And sometimes it may lead us to realize, okay, there are some things that aren't really that important, and there are some things that are more important. And maybe I need to reevaluate where have I been giving my time and energy. So taking a step back to really think about what really matters is one step. Talk, as he was just saying in the video. Painful feelings need to be expressed for you to heal. Now, this may be a challenge not just to some people who are grieving, but some people who are just naturally quiet. Some people who don't talk much, they don't like small talk, they don't like to be in groups, they don't like socializing. So this could be that much more of a struggle for somebody with that type of experience and that personality. But it is still an important part of the process. Grief takes a physical and an emotional toll. Look after your health with rest, proper nutrition, and exercise. Now, it's easy to say these things, but when a person is genuinely grieving, they probably don't want to do any of this. They're not thinking about proper nutrition. They're not thinking about exercise. They're probably not thinking about getting enough rest, but they should be. And again, the goal is to, as they come to that place of acceptance, to be able to prioritize these things again if they were a part of that person's life, because these are things that are helpful for the individual in dealing with grief. Honor your loved one's memory. Preserve your memories in ways that are comforting and meaningful. You know, sometimes what people do when they lose a loved one and they have that loved one cremated, and they keep that person's ashes. And sometimes they not only keep them, but I've even seen or heard of cases where a person may wear those ashes around their neck. And I've wondered, you know, that's not for everybody. And there are different ways in which a person can honor the memory of a loved one. But as long as those memories are preserved in some way that will be comforting and meaningful to the individual, whatever they choose to do, whether it's ashes, whether it's pictures, whether it's songs, whatever it is that can remind them of that individual, preserve those memories with them, that can also be healing. Avoid using substances to numb your feelings, as this will only prolong the pain. Plan ahead for special occasions. Anniversaries and festive holidays can be stressful times. Birthdays, occasions that bring up the reminder of that individual, whether it's a birthday, whether it's some other holiday that occurs, anything that will bring those thoughts back to mind. In fact, I just recently had someone tell me that it's been about, I think they said 10 years since their parent passed. And so just recently they were responding to that by doing something that takes them back to that experience, going back to their hometown. Because even though it's been 10 or so years, the memories are still there, the thoughts are still there, and perhaps the pain is still there. So maybe by going back to that experience, going back to that place where they've connected in the past when they were still here, helps them move forward. Don't isolate yourself. Ease back into social contacts and find new opportunities to engage with people. It's the third time now where we've discussed the idea of isolation, because that actually works against someone. So this is also relevant in the case that we know someone who may be isolating themselves in response to some kind of loss. Because if we know that and we understand that and we realize that that's really not best for them, that can inform how we involve ourselves in that person's life. Going back to number 3, where it says, grief takes a physical and an emotional toll. One of the ways, now these are some examples here: rest, proper nutrition, and exercise. These are some of the ways in which a person can begin to come out of that and begin to move towards taking better care of themselves because they begin to feel better. But there are other ways, other expressions of self-care that can actually be helpful in getting through the grieving process. For example, taking care of your mind and thoughts. If we focus too much on the negative, then where is that going to leave us? In a negative state of mind. And that will probably be the very thing that keeps a person in the bed that much longer, keep them isolated, keep them disengaged, keep them disinterested in other areas of life, because their thinking is so focused on the loss and the negative. Related to that, taking care of your emotions and trying to find ways to go beyond just focusing on the negative, just focusing on the loss, but focusing on perhaps some good things to remember and reflect on from that loss, some good memories associated with one's past. Taking care of your spiritual health. Person may be grieving, and what may they start to do? You no longer see them in church. Maybe they were coming every Sunday or maybe every other week, and now it's been months and you haven't seen them. No longer taking care of their spiritual health. Maybe they're mad at God, so they're no longer reading, they're no longer praying, no longer involving themselves in forms of service, not attending church, any of that. If they're not taking care of their spiritual health, that will have implications for their mental health and their emotional health. The previous slide alluded to this one, taking care of your physical health and body, and even increasing your own well-being through self-care behaviors. The point here is that as a person is able to care for themselves in their entirety, this is one of the things that can help move them through that grief process. And it is when they begin to, say, disregard these things or minimize the importance of them, that is just going to prolong the problem. And it's going to prolong the grief, and it's going to prolong the negative thoughts and the negative emotions that they are experiencing. I like the idea of the growth perspective, even in the context of loss, because the reality of it is that although it's something we never want to go through, sometimes good actually comes from it.
It's been so hard to watch my little girl suffer. As much as I wish I could keep her forever, I'm ready for her to go to a state of rest.
On February 9th, 2007, my family was hit by a drunk teenage driver, and killed in that accident was my wife, Michelle, who was expecting our 5th child, and then my 2nd oldest son, Benjamin, and my only daughter, Anna. I saw a pair of headlights coming at me at an incredibly fast rate of speed, and I tried to do some maneuvers to get out of the way. It was too late.
When I walked into the hospital, they took me to the room where they were working on his body. And when I got in there, my wife, she put her arm around me. And they announced that he passed away. It was like our perfect world, our perfect life, all of a sudden had come crashing down on us.
They say the grief is heavy, and it is true. It feels like a huge burden that's on you, and you just can't get out of it by yourself. To be able to turn to music and to express how I'm feeling and my emotions in that time. So I wrote this song in my heart in memory of my little sister, Holly, who passed away from cancer. I remember all the times we laughed. I remember all the times we cried. I have memories of you and me together, memories that I'll always have inside.
The sun came out, it was just kind of making me sad every time, and I just couldn't spend the time out there. So asking just a few friends if they would be willing to come over and rake up some leaves and pull the weeds that were growing.
And that's the best thing about it is it started with a little text, but as soon as the word got out, everyone's all, please let me know how I could help.
there's a bit of a helplessness, I think, when you watch somebody that you love suffer and there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to take it away. And I think Heidi showed me that you just show up and you just listen and you just say, I love you.
I had a sense that I had to pick myself up and keep moving forward, that I still had 2 boys that were depending on me to be a father. And it has been incredibly difficult to have to learn those lessons in the way that I've learned them. And as I look at my ability now to have patience, and as I especially look at my ability to have empathy with those who are lonely, with those who have had loss, I realize now that I am much more capable to reach out and to serve in a way that I could not do before February 9th. Nurture and minister with authenticity.
A couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks after Austin passed away, John Manning called me and said he was going to pick me for basketball. I didn't want to go, but because my wife and I had made that agreement that anyone who invited us to do anything, that we were going to go do it. So John picked me up at 5:15, and we were in the car, and I just talked about what I was experiencing, what I was learning, feelings I was having, and he just listened.
We were in a very difficult emotional state at that moment, but we knew that we needed help. We really needed to rely on our Heavenly Father, our Savior Jesus Christ. We needed to have that connection. It's, I think, a healing process, at least for me. We need to be able to grieve.
But that even in those hardest times, you can find happiness, I really believe. And I don't just believe it, I've seen it in my life. I mean, we have dealt with very difficult years, and in the same moment have felt huge amounts of joy. And so to be able to contrast those and appreciate the joy, appreciate the beauty and the good in life, everything's so much more vibrant. There's so much more color in our life.
And I've really learned through this experience that if someone else is going through a major tragedy, major trauma, don't stay away. Don't just give them their space. Love them. Be there for them. Listen to them.
So the idea of growing through grief, one of the things that was said in the video is how because of what they went through, they were able to empathize more. They were able to better connect with others. They had a new sensitivity to other people. They had a greater awareness of what grieving actually looks like and what that healing process entails. So seeing growth that can come from grief is an important aspect of the healing process. Doesn't necessarily mean being able to connect all the dots and make logical sense of what a person is experiencing, but being able to come to terms with it, accept it, and like the one guy said, be able to move on from it and to move forward. That's growing in the midst of grief. Couple of takeaways. Grief is a natural, normal process for dealing with significant loss. And here's an important point. There are both healthy and unhealthy ways to process. We know that loss is inevitable. We live long enough, we're going to experience it. We can't avoid it. The question, though, is how is a person going to respond to it? Healthy or in unhealthy ways. We saw examples of unhealthy ways: anger, isolation, wanting to give up. But then we also saw healthy ways of responding to it, connecting with others, receiving help from others, talking about it, not isolating oneself, and actually trying to get back into life's routines. doing things that are going to help the person move forward, because they can't change what happened, but they can do something about how they are responding to it as it pertains to their future. Accepting and healing from grief is possible and can provide us with hope for the future. Because sometimes if a person is grieving, they don't see a whole lot of hope. They're not thinking about what's going to come in the future that's going to turn things around. All they see is the problem before them. But as they get to that acceptance stage and as they pursue the healing, because it doesn't just come automatically, there are steps in which the person needs to take as well that fosters more healing in their life. As they do those things, they can find more healing and they can, thankfully, embrace hope for the future. So in thinking about not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us as we work with people and as we encounter people who are grieving, let's be mindful of the fact that where they are is not necessarily where they have to stay. And it may not be where they are the next time we may see them or encounter them, especially if they're taking steps towards more and more healing in their life. Accepting it with the realization that they can still go forward. They still have a life to live, and God can help us and will help us to find that peace and that security going forward. Any questions or comments?
Very good.
Why don't we close, if you wouldn't mind bowing with me. We're going to close in word of prayer, and as we think about and reflect on this content, think about how it might help us going forward. God, thank you for an opportunity to talk about such a relevant and serious topic. Thank you for the tips that you've been able to provide and help us in coping with and being able to help others cope with the grief and the loss that they experience. And I pray that you'll help us as we may encounter people who are grieving or who will be grieving at some point to be able to genuinely help them. And also pray when we deal with our own grief that you will provide the means of help for us, because we all will be grieving at some point. And I pray that you'll not only help us in that moment, but prepare us to be of help and service to someone else who will need it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So on the table, there's a flyer for an upcoming presentation that will be offered next month, if you're interested in that. And if you would like to also take one of our brochures, and we'll also have some other events and workshops coming up in the future as well.